My grandmother's 70th birthday dinner, she reached across the table, pressed 2 fingers against her wrist, and held them there for exactly 3 seconds. My breath caught. I hadn't seen that gesture in over 20 years, not since I was 7 years old, and she taught it to me in her kitchen, whispering that it was our special secret. 2 fingers on the wrist meant one thing and one thing only. I need you. Something is wrong. Everyone else at the table was laughing at something her boyfriend had just said. He had that kind of laugh that fills a room, loud, practiced, the kind that makes strangers turn their heads. I watched my grandmother smile along with everyone else, but her eyes, when they found mine, weren't smiling at all. Before I tell you what happened that night, I want you to take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me start from the beginning. My grandmother raised me. That's the simplest way to say it. My mother left when I was 4, and my father worked double shifts at a shipping warehouse just to keep the lights on, so it was my grandmother's house where I grew up. Her kitchen, her rules, her voice reading to me at night. She was the kind of woman who kept a paper calendar on the fridge and circled every birthday 3 weeks in advance. She made her own pie crusts from scratch. She knew every neighbor on her street by name and by dog breed. She was, without question, the most capable person I have ever known. Her name is Beverly. She is 70 years old and she deserves every good thing in this world. When my grandfather passed away 6 years ago, something shifted in her. Not dramatically, not all at once. She still made the pies. She still circled the birthdays. But the house got quieter in a way I couldn't fix, no matter how often I visited. She started watching the evening news with the volume too loud. She kept my grandfather's reading glasses on the side table for almost a year before she finally put them away. She told me once on a drive home from the grocery store that the hardest part wasn't the grief. It was the silence after. The way a whole life could just stop making noise. I understood then that she was lonely in a way I couldn't reach. About 18 months ago, she joined a community gardening program through her local parks department. It was something my grandfather had always wanted to do, and she said starting it felt like finishing something for him. That's where she met him. She called me one Sunday and mentioned almost as an aside that there was a man in her gardening group who had been helping her carry the heavier planters. His name was Gordon. She described him as gentlemanly. Old-fashioned in a good way, she said. Brought 2 coffees to the Tuesday sessions without being asked. I told her that sounded sweet. I meant it. The first time I met Gordon, it was at her house for a Sunday dinner she'd been cooking all day. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table like he'd been sitting there for years. He stood up immediately, offered his hand, and said my grandmother talked about me constantly. He had a clean haircut, a pressed shirt, and he complimented her pot roast twice before we even sat down. He was 72, recently widowed himself. His wife had passed 3 years prior, and he had a son in Phoenix he mentioned once and never brought up again. Something about that last part lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind, but I pushed it away. My grandmother looked lighter than she had in years. She kept touching his arm when she laughed. She had worn her good earrings. I wasn't going to be the person who dimmed that. Over the following months, Gordon became a fixture. He was at every family dinner, every holiday. He learned how my father took his coffee. He remembered that my cousin was applying to nursing school and asked for updates. He was attentive in the way that when you are hoping someone good has finally entered your family, feels like relief. My grandmother glowed. I told myself that was enough. Last fall, she called to tell me they had gotten engaged. She said it almost shyly, like she was bracing for me to have an opinion about it. I told her I was happy for her. I told her she deserved someone who showed up. She laughed and said, "Honey, he does more than show up." The wedding was small. Just immediate family in her backyard, under the oak tree my grandfather had planted when they first bought the house. Gordon cried during the vows, real tears, not the polished kind. My father shook his hand for a long time afterward. She sold her house 3 months later and moved into his. At first, this seemed practical. His house was newer, 1 story, easier on her knees. She said it made sense. Gordon said a fresh start was good for both of them. I helped her pack up the kitchen and we made a whole day of it, playing old records and wrapping her good dishes in newspaper. She seemed happy. I told myself that meant everything was fine, but the calls changed. It started gradually. She would call every Sunday without fail. That had been our rhythm since I left for college. Then the calls started coming every other week, then less. When I called her instead, sometimes the phone would ring 8, 9 times. When she did pick up, there was often background noise, like she was in another room from where she wanted to be. Once, a man's voice said something in the background, and she said quickly, "I have to go, sweetheart. I'll call you tomorrow." She didn't call the next day. I told myself she was just adjusting to a new home, a new routine. Newly married people get absorbed in each other. That's normal. Then my cousin called me. She had stopped by the house unannounced to drop off a birthday gift and said Gordon had answered the door. He told her my grandmother was resting and couldn't have visitors. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. My cousin said he was perfectly polite about it, smiling, thanking her for coming, but that he closed the door before she could say another word. When she texted my grandmother afterward, the reply came 4 hours later and just said, "Sorry I missed you. Feeling a bit tired lately." My grandmother had never been a tired person in her life. I brought it up gently the next time we spoke. She laughed it off, said Gordon was just protective, that he worried about her energy levels since she'd had a minor health scare the previous spring, something with her blood pressure that I was hearing about for the first time. I asked why she hadn't told me about the health scare. She paused for just a moment too long and then said it hadn't seemed like a big deal. That was when I first felt it. Not alarm exactly, just a low, steady unease, like a sound at the edge of hearing. The birthday dinner was Gordon's idea. He wanted to celebrate her properly, he said. He booked a private room at a restaurant downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and a prise menu, and invited 12 people, mostly her friends from the gardening program and a few family members. He arranged the flowers himself. He gave a toast that made 3 people at the table cry. Watching him that night, I understood why no one had questioned anything. He was extraordinary at this. Every gesture was calibrated, every word landed exactly where he intended it. He refilled glasses before they were empty. He knew which of her friends had dietary restrictions. He touched the small of her back when he stood beside her, a gesture that looked like love and felt, the longer I watched, like something else. My grandmother was seated across from me. About 40 minutes into dinner, while Gordon was telling a story that had everyone leaning in, she turned her head and looked directly at me. Then she pressed 2 fingers against her left wrist and held them there. 1, 2, 3 seconds. The room kept moving around me, but I stopped. I knew that signal. She had taught it to me when I was small, during a period when her sister was going through something difficult and the adults needed a private language. She had pressed my small hand to her wrist and said, "If I ever do this, it means I need you to pay attention." Something isn't right. I hadn't thought about it in more than 2 decades. I hadn't needed to. She looked away before anyone noticed. Her expression didn't change. She laughed at the end of Gordon's story with everyone else. But I had seen it. I didn't react. I reached for my water glass, smiled at something my father said, and kept breathing. If she had used the signal in a room full of people, it meant the most important thing right now was for nothing to look different. I started watching Gordon differently. Every time my grandmother started to speak, he would often finish her sentence, not rudely, almost warmly, but consistently. When one of her friends asked how she was enjoying the new neighborhood, Gordon answered before she could open her mouth. When her phone buzzed on the table, he glanced at the screen before she did. Not dramatically. Just a flicker of the eyes, quick enough that you'd miss it if you weren't already paying attention. At one point, I excused myself from the table and passed behind her chair. I let my hand rest on her shoulder for a moment, and bent down to say happy birthday close to her ear. Very quietly, without moving her lips much, she said, "Not here." Before I could respond, Gordon appeared at her other side with a refilled glass and a smile aimed directly at me. "Great party, right?" he said. "Wonderful," I said. On the drive home, my husband didn't speak for a while. He knew me well enough to wait. When I finally told him about the signal, about what it meant, about the way she had said "not here," he didn't dismiss it. He just said, "Then we start paying attention." My husband is a CPA. He has spent 15 years working with estate attorneys and financial planners, and he has seen the paperwork left behind by people who were taken advantage of in the last chapters of their lives. He knows what the patterns look like before they become disasters. That night, after I was asleep, he started quietly looking into things. What he found over the next 3 days unfolded slowly, each piece more unsettling than the last. Gordon had been married before. Not once, twice after his first wife died. Both women were widows. Both were in their late 60s or early 70s when they met him. Both marriages had ended quietly, with the women moving away and, in one case, selling a property at a significant loss within a year of the separation. There were no criminal records, no restraining orders, just a pattern of older women whose financial situations appeared to have quietly contracted during their time with him. There was something else. My grandmother's house, the house my grandfather had bought in 1987, the one with the oak tree in the backyard, had been sold. We knew that. But my husband pulled the sale records, and the timeline was tighter than she had let on. The house sold 6 weeks after the wedding, and the proceeds, a number that made my chest tighten when I saw it, had been deposited into a joint account that had been opened the week before the sale. I called her the next morning. Gordon answered. He said she was at a doctor's appointment and he would pass along my message. I asked which doctor. He said he wasn't sure of the name offhand. I thanked him and hung up. She called me back 4 hours later from a number I didn't recognize. She said it was a phone she kept in her purse and that she didn't use it much anymore. Her voice was careful in a way that broke my heart. She told me to listen and not ask questions until she was done. After they married and she moved into his house, he had begun managing her finances. It started as a kindness. She found the online banking interfaces confusing and he offered to help. Then her accounts were consolidated into joint accounts. Then he began questioning her purchases. Small things at first. Why had she bought a gift for my cousin's baby shower? Did she really need new shoes? Was that magazine subscription necessary? She said she had told herself he was just being careful, that he had lost a lot in his first marriage and was cautious about money. She had wanted to be understanding. Then her investment accounts came up. My grandfather had been meticulous. Over 40 years, he had quietly built a retirement portfolio. Not large by any financial standard, but real, and entirely hers. When my grandmother mentioned it to Gordon early in their relationship, she said his interest shifted in a way she hadn't been able to name at the time. After the wedding, he began bringing it up regularly. He had a financial advisor he trusted, he said. Someone who could help her money work harder. She should consider consolidating everything. She had resisted. And that was when things changed. He started keeping track of her calls. He didn't take her phone, not exactly, but he would ask who she had spoken to. If she had a long conversation with me or with my cousin, he would be quiet and distant for the rest of the evening in a way that made her feel she had done something wrong. She started keeping calls short to avoid it. She started apologizing for things she hadn't done. She told me that 2 months ago he had sat down with her and said something she hadn't been able to stop thinking about since. He told her that he had sacrificed a great deal for this marriage, that he had given up certain financial opportunities to be with her, that it was only fair that she contribute meaningfully to their shared future. He placed a document on the table, a transfer of investment account authorization, and told her to think about it carefully. She hadn't signed it. But he hadn't stopped asking. When she finished, I didn't say anything for a moment. I asked her if she was safe. Right now, in this moment. She said she thought so. He wasn't violent. He had never threatened her physically. But he had said more than once that if she ever told her family that things weren't good between them, no one would believe her. That she had come to him. That she had been the lonely widow. That the story was hers to be ashamed of. That sentence made me cold. I told her not to sign anything. I told her I loved her and that she had done absolutely nothing wrong. I told her I would handle this carefully and that nothing would blow up without her knowing first. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I taught you that signal and I never thought I'd have to use it. I'm glad you remembered." That afternoon, my husband and I made a plan. We did not go to Gordon directly. My husband had seen enough cases to know that confronting someone like this without documentation was the fastest way to make everything harder. Instead, he contacted an elder law attorney, a woman he had worked with on a probate case 2 years earlier, and explained the situation. She was very still on the phone, listening, and then she said this was not the first time she had heard a story shaped like this one. She advised us on the next steps. My grandmother needed to remove herself from the joint accounts and restore sole control of her investment portfolio before anything was transferred. To do this safely, she needed documentation showing the account changes were made voluntarily, with legal counsel present, and she needed to do it on a day when Gordon was not available to interfere. It took us 11 days to arrange it. My grandmother told Gordon she had a medical appointment. My cousin picked her up and drove her to the attorney's office, where we were all waiting. She walked in wearing her good coat and sat down at the conference table, and I watched something settle in her face that had been unsettled for a long time. The attorney laid out the process clearly. It took most of the morning. By noon, the investment accounts had been restored to sole ownership. The joint checking account was separated, with her portion moved to a new account in her name only at a different bank, with a new debit card and new login credentials that no one else had. After it was done, we sat in the parking lot for a while. My grandmother had a cup of coffee from the machine in the lobby, and she held it with both hands. She said she kept waiting to feel stupid. I told her she wasn't stupid. She was someone who had believed a person who had spent a great deal of time practicing how to be believed. That wasn't the same thing. She nodded, but I could see she was still working through it. That evening, my husband and I went to the house. Gordon opened the door, smiling. My husband shook his hand and said we just wanted to stop by. Gordon led us into the living room where my grandmother was already sitting, her hands folded, her expression steady. My husband sat across from Gordon and talked for a few minutes about nothing, the weather, the restaurant from the birthday dinner. Then he mentioned, almost conversationally, that his firm had recently been involved in a case involving financial elder abuse. Said it had become something of a specialty area given how common the patterns were. Said the paper trails in these situations were often more complete than people realized. Gordon laughed. Asked what that had to do with anything. My husband placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside were the public marriage records, the property transactions from his previous marriages, the timeline of account consolidations in this marriage, and a one-page summary from the elder law attorney. Gordon looked at the folder. Then he looked at my grandmother. Then back at the folder. He said there was clearly a misunderstanding. My grandmother said very quietly that she had already met with an attorney that morning, that her accounts had been restructured, that she would be contacting a family law attorney about an annulment the following week. Gordon's expression did something complicated. The warmth didn't drain out slowly. It just vanished, like a light switching off. What was left was a stillness that I found much more honest than anything that had come before it. He said he'd like to speak with her alone. My husband said that wasn't going to happen. Gordon stood. He straightened his shirt. He said something about being treated unfairly and gathered his keys from the entry table with the careful movements of someone performing dignity they don't feel. He left without saying goodbye. We filed a report with the County Adult Protective Services office the next morning. The elder law attorney connected us with a detective who handled financial exploitation cases. When the detective reached out to the women from Gordon's previous marriages, one of them, a woman in her mid-70s living in another state, agreed to speak. She had been waiting for years for someone to ask. The case is ongoing. Gordon retained a lawyer. There may be no criminal charges, depending on what the investigation finds and what the previous women are willing to formally document. The attorney was honest with us about that. These cases are difficult. The paper trails show patterns, not always intent in the legal sense. But the accounts are protected. The property is protected. And my grandmother's annulment was finalized 7 weeks later. She is living with my father for now, in the guest room that used to be my childhood room. She has put up a small bird feeder outside the window, and she sits with her coffee in the mornings and watches it. She talks about finding a smaller place of her own in the spring, something with a little outdoor space where she can grow tomatoes. 2 weekends ago, I came over for Sunday dinner. She had made her pot roast, the one Gordon had complimented twice before he even sat down. Afterward, we were washing dishes together, and she got quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I spent months trying to figure out if I was seeing things clearly. He was very good at making me feel like I wasn't." I told her the fact that she used the signal, that she trusted herself enough to reach across that table and ask for help, even silently, even in a room full of people. That mattered. That was her, still knowing her own mind, even when someone had been working very hard to convince her otherwise. She handed me a plate to dry. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather taught me that the people who love you are the ones worth signaling to." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Some people spend years building a language no one else can hear, and if you're lucky, the person who taught you that language is still there to use it when it counts. I keep coming back to the moment my grandmother pressed those 2 fingers to her wrist. A gesture she taught me when I was 7 years old, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and dish soap, during a time when the adults around us needed a private language. She had pressed my small hand over hers and said, If I ever do this, pay attention. Something isn't right. I filed it away the way children file away things they don't fully understand yet, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. I didn't think about it again for over 20 years. And then there it was. Across a white tablecloth, in a room full of people laughing at one of Gordon's stories, my grandmother looked at me and asked for help, the only way she safely could. What strikes me now, looking back, is what it took for her to do that. She had spent months being slowly convinced that her own instincts were wrong, that she was overreacting, that the man sitting beside her had only her best interests at heart. That's what this kind of manipulation does. It doesn't arrive as cruelty. It arrives as concern. It arrives as helpfulness. It borrows the language of love and uses it to build walls. And after long enough inside those walls, you start to forget what the outside felt like. But some part of my grandmother never stopped knowing. And that's the thing I want to sit with because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. There's a version of my grandmother who didn't use the signal, who talked herself out of it, who thought, he'll be upset, or no one will believe me, or maybe I really am imagining things. I think about her sometimes. I think about how easy it would have been to get there. She is one of the sharpest, most capable women I have ever known, and it still almost happened to her. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's the result of sustained, calculated pressure from someone who had done this before and knew exactly which levers to pull. What saved her wasn't one thing. It was three things working together. And I've thought about this a lot. It was her integrity, the part of her that, even after months of being told her instincts were wrong, still trusted them enough to reach across a table and ask for help. That moral core that Gordon couldn't quite reach no matter how hard he tried. Some people would call that stubbornness. I call it knowing who you are. It was clarity of mind, the willingness to see the pattern for what it was, once someone helped her lay it out. My husband pulling those records, the attorney explaining the legal exposure, my grandmother sitting in that conference room and processing all of it without flinching. It would have been easier to look away. She didn't. And it was the courage to act anyway, even when she was scared, even when she didn't know exactly how it would unfold, even when Gordon was still in that house and the outcome wasn't certain. She got in my cousin's car. She walked into that attorney's office. She sat at that table and made the calls that needed to be made. Gordon counted on her staying quiet. He had built an entire system around the assumption that she would. What he didn't account for was that she had spent 70 years building something he couldn't see and couldn't take, a character that held, even under that kind of pressure. I don't think people like Gordon are inevitable, but I do think silence is what keeps them moving from one life to the next. My grandmother ended that silence. Not dramatically. Not with a scene. Just with 2 fingers pressed to her wrist in a room full of people who had no idea anything was wrong. That was enough. It was more than enough.